The Galactic Council chambers had never witnessed such unanimous laughter. 17 different species, each representing thousands of star systems, their translators working overtime to convey the collective mirth that rippled through the crystalline amphitheater of Nexus Prime. At the center of it all stood Ambassador Elena Vasquez, her small human frame dwarfed by the towering representatives around her. Yet she maintained her composure with the kind of quiet dignity that her species had somehow perfected. Over millennia of conflict, the humans, wheezed the Cytherian representative, through his breathing apparatus, his 6 arms gesticulating wildly, wished to contribute to the war effort against the Void Syndicate. The statement triggered another wave of chittering, growling, and harmonic vibrations that passed for laughter among the assembled species. Commander Zethkri of the Hegemony Navy, a reptilian creature whose scales had been earned through 3 centuries of warfare, leaned forward on his massive haunches. His voice carried the authority of someone who had personally overseen the glassing of 12 rebel worlds. Little mammal, your species has been part of the galactic community for barely 2 standard cycles. The Void Syndicate has been the scourge of civilized space for over 4,000 years. They have consumed entire star clusters, reduced mighty civilizations to cosmic dust, and turned the outer rim into a graveyard of worlds. The holographic displays around the chamber flickered to life, showing the devastating scope of the Syndicate's latest campaign. Entire solar systems simply gone, not destroyed, not conquered, consumed. Where once proud civilizations had thrived, now only empty space remained. Not even debris to mark their passing. Your contribution, continued the Altarian collectives. Hive Mind Speaker, her crystalline form pulsing with condescending patterns, while appreciated in spirit, would be quaint. Your largest warship mass is barely 50,000 tons. Our escort frigates are 10 times that size. The Syndicate's dreadnoughts are larger than your homeworld's moons. Elena had heard variations of this speech 17 times in the past month, as Earth's application to join the Grand Alliance had been shuffled from committee to committee. Each time, the response was the same, polite dismissal wrapped in cosmic condescension. The humans were too young, too primitive, too small to matter in a conflict that spanned galaxies. Furthermore, added the Vorthan Empire's War Marshal, his for heads speaking in unsettling harmony, your species shows alarming signs of internal conflict. Your historical records speak of something called world wars. The very concept is barbaric. How can a species that cannot achieve peace on a single planet hope to contribute to interstellar warfare? The chamber erupted in agreement. The ethereal conclave's representative, a being of pure energy contained within a shimmering field, pulsed with what could only be described as amusement. Perhaps they could serve as, what do they call it, cannon fodder, though even that seems generous. Given their technological limitations, Elena waited. She had learned, in her brief time among the stars, that patience was often mistaken for weakness by species that had forgotten what it meant to fight for survival. Her dark eyes swept the chamber, cataloging each representative, each species, each dismissive gesture and condescending tone. She thought of the files locked away in the deepest vaults of Earth's military archives, of the projects that had been deemed too dangerous, even for a species that had invented nuclear weapons. As an afterthought, honored representatives, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I understand your concerns. Humanity is indeed young by galactic standards. We have been in space for barely 300 years, and among the stars for less than 50. Our ships are small, our weapons primitive by your standards. And yes, we have a history of conflict. She paused, letting the admission settle. Several representatives exchanged glances that clearly said finally, some honesty from the mammals. However, Elena continued, I would like to respectfully request that you reconsider, not because of what we bring to the table now, but because of what we might become when properly motivated. The Nexari delegate, a graceful being whose species had perfected the art of diplomatic warfare, tilted her elegant head. And what, pray tell, could possibly motivate your species to transcend its limitations? Elena's smile was small, almost imperceptible, but something in it made the ambient temperature of the chamber seem to drop by several degrees. The same thing. that has motivated every significant advancement in human history, honored delegate. The realization that our survival depends on it. The laughter that followed was even more pronounced than before. The Cytherian representative was now making sounds that his translator couldn't even process. The Vorthan war marshals' heads were bobbing in what passed for mirth among his kind. Survival. Boomed the hegemony commander. Child, your species. Lives in one of the most protected sectors of the galaxy. The Syndicate is 17,000 light-years away from your little blue world. Even if they somehow bypass the combined fleet's defensive lines, the Nexus Point fortifications, and the stellar barrier itself, they would have to fight through 47 other member species before reaching Earth. Your survival is not in question. Elena nodded slowly, as if conceding the point. You're absolutely right, Commander. Earth is perfectly safe. The Syndicate couldn't possibly threaten us. She paused, looking around the chamber with those unnervingly calm eyes. But that wasn't the survival I was referring to. The laughter began to fade as delegates realized that the human ambassador wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed to be getting started. You see, Elena continued, humans have a peculiar relationship with conflict. We don't just fight to survive, we fight to win. And when we're told that we can't win, when we're dismissed as too small, too young, too primitive, that's when we tend to surprise people. She gestured to the holographic displays showing the Syndicate's advance. For 4,000 years, your civilizations have fought the Syndicate to a standstill. For 1,000 years of the greatest military minds in galactic history, backed by resources that span thousands of worlds, wielding weapons that can crack planets, and the best you've managed is a stalemate. The chamber had grown uncomfortably quiet. Several delegates were beginning to shift uneasily. Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful, Elena said, though her tone suggested she was about to be exactly that, but from a human perspective, that's not a very impressive track record. In fact, it's the kind of problem that makes us curious. The Altarian Collective's speaker pulsed with irritation. Curious about what, exactly? Elena's smile widened slightly, and for the first time since arriving on Nexus Prime, she looked genuinely pleased. About whether you've been fighting the wrong war. The silence that followed was deafening. In the vast chamber, with its representatives of 17 species and thousands of worlds, the only sound was the gentle hum of the life support systems and the distant vibration of the station's massive engines. Finally, Commander Zethkri found his voice. Explain. Well, Elena said, settling into her stance like a professor preparing for a lecture. Humanity spent most of its early history fighting the same kind of war you're fighting now. Big armies, bigger weapons, whoever could field the most force won. It worked, to a point. But we're a stubborn species, and we don't like losing. She gestured to the tactical displays. So we started thinking differently. Instead of asking how do we field a bigger army, we started asking how do we make the enemy's army irrelevant. Instead of building bigger weapons, we started building smarter ones. Instead of fighting the war our enemy wanted us to fight, we started fighting the war we wanted to fight. The Nexari delegate leaned forward. Her interest clearly piqued despite herself. And what war would that be? Elena's expression grew thoughtful. The kind where the enemy never sees us coming, never knows we're there, and never realizes they've lost until it's far too late to do anything about it. She moved to the central display, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface with practiced ease. The image shifted, showing not the Syndicate's advance, but something else entirely, a complex web of supply lines, communication networks, and resource flows that kept the enemy war machine functioning. The Syndicate is powerful, Elena acknowledged, but power requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires logistics, and logistics. She paused, her finger hovering over a particularly dense node in the network. Well, logistics is something humans have gotten very, very good at disrupting. The chamber erupted in protests and objections, but Elena held up a hand. I'm not suggesting we abandon your current strategy. The combined fleet has done incredible work holding the line. But while you've been fighting the war they wanted you to fight, you've given us time to study them, to understand them, to figure out how they think, how they operate, and most importantly, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, how They die. The Vorthan war marshals for heads were no longer bobbing with amusement. You speak of studying an enemy you have never faced, in a war you have never fought. Have we not? Elena asked. Commander, with respect. You've been fighting the Syndicate for millennia. In that time, how many of their ships have you captured intact? How many of their communications have you decrypted? How many of their leaders have you interrogated? The uncomfortable silence was answer enough. Humans, Elena continued, have been at war for our entire recorded history. We've fought everyone, other tribes, other nations, other ideologies. And eventually, ourselves, we've learned to fight on land, in the air, in the sea, in space, and in dimensions most species don't even know exist. But most importantly, we've learned that every enemy, no matter how powerful, has weaknesses. You just have to be creative enough to find them. She touched the display again, and the image shifted to show a series of intercepted Syndicate communications data that no galactic intelligence service had ever managed to obtain. For the past 2 years, Elena said quietly, while you've been debating whether to admit us to your alliance, we've been conducting our own little war. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would show up on your sensors, just probing, testing, learning. The implications of her words hit the chamber like a physical blow. The ethereal conclave's representative flickered with what could only be described as shock. You've been conducting unauthorized operations in hostile space? Unauthorized by whom? Elena asked with innocent curiosity. We're not members of your alliance yet, remember? We're under no obligation to follow your rules of engagement. Commander, Zethkri's massive form seemed to swell with indignation. You could have compromised our entire defensive strategy. If the Syndicate detected your activities, they didn't. Elena interrupted. That's rather the point. You see, Commander, you fight like civilized beings. You announce your presence, identify your targets, engage in honorable combat. It's very proper, very galactic. Her smile returned, and this time it was definitely not reassuring. Humans don't fight like that. We fight like the universe is trying to kill us, and we're too stubborn to die. The chamber fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, the kind that preceded either violence or revelation. So Elena said, straightening her jacket with casual precision, the question before this council is not whether humanity is ready to join your war. The question is whether you're ready to join ours. She stood there in the center of the chamber, surrounded by beings who could level continents with a thought, representing species that had ruled the stars since before Earth's sun had formed. And somehow impossibly she was the one who seemed to be in control. Because whether you accept our application or not, Elena concluded, we're going to end this war. The only question is whether you want to be there when we do. The silence stretched on, heavy with implications and possibilities that none of the assembled delegates had considered. When they'd first laughed at the small human ambassador and her species' presumptuous offer of help. In the distance, barely audible over the station's hum, came the sound of incoming priority communications from the outer rim. Reports of Syndicate supply convoys simply vanishing, of their forward bases going dark without warning, of their communications networks experiencing inexplicable failures that seemed to cascade through their entire command structure. And in the center of it all, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood waiting, her expression patient and professional, as if she hadn't just implied that her species had been waging a shadow war against the most feared enemy in galactic history. The laughter had stopped, and somehow, nobody in the chamber felt like smiling anymore. The priority communications continued to flood in, each report more disturbing than the last. Commander Zethkri's tactical displays lit up with emergency beacons from across the outer rim, painting a picture that should have been impossible. The Syndicate's third fleet of formation, that had been steadily advancing for 6 months, had simply stopped responding to hails 3 days ago. Their 7th supply contingent had vanished without a trace. Most unsettling of all, their primary communication relay at Kepler 442, a fortress that had withstood siege for 2 centuries, had gone dark exactly 47 minutes after Elena had begun speaking. Coincidence, muttered the Altarian collective's speaker. Though her crystalline form flickered with uncertainty, these things happen in war. Elena's expression remained politely neutral. They do indeed. Though I have to say, your definition of coincidence is rather more flexible than ours." She gestured to the incoming reports with casual interest. "For instance, would you consider it coincidental that each of these incidents occurred at precisely the moment when the syndicate forces were most vulnerable, when their command staff were in transit, when their defensive grids were cycling, when their supply convoys were between protective umbrellas?" The Nexari delegate's elegant features had gone pale. "You're suggesting your species has been conducting precision strikes against hardened syndicate positions? With what fleet? Our intelligence networks show no human vessels beyond the Terran border." "That's correct," Elena agreed pleasantly. "Your intelligence networks are quite thorough. Very impressive, really. We've been monitoring them for months." The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. The ethereal conclave's representative flickered through several colors, before settling on a deep crimson that suggested barely controlled fury. "You've been monitoring our classified intelligence networks." "Oh, not just monitoring," Elena clarified with the tone of someone discussing the weather. "We've been improving them. Did you notice the 17% increase in data processing efficiency across your outer rim stations? The reduction in transmission lag between sectors 7 and 9? The mysterious resolution of those persistent encryption errors that have been plaguing your deep space communications?" Commander Zethkri's massive claws scraped against the metallic floor. "You've been inside our military networks without authorization. That's an act of war." Elena tilted her head thoughtfully. "Is it? Against whom? We're not at war with the Galactic Council. We've actually been quite helpful, as I just mentioned. And we're certainly not at war with the Syndicate after all. According to this very council, we're too primitive to pose any threat to anyone." She moved to another display, her fingers dancing across the controls with the familiarity of someone who had clearly practiced this presentation. The holographic projection shifted to show a detailed schematic of something that made several delegates gasp in recognition. "This," Elena said, "is a Syndicate Harvester-class world ship, 12 kilometers long, armed with planet crackers, defended by shields that can withstand supernova-level energy output. One of these ships destroyed the Altarian colony at Vega Prime 3 years ago, killed 4 billion people in under 6 hours. The Altarian representative's crystalline form pulsed with painful memories. "We are aware of the capabilities of Harvester-class vessels. I'm sure you are," Elena said gently. "What you might not be aware of is that there are currently 17 of these ships in the Syndicate fleet. Magnificent vessels, really. Engineering marvels. Each one is essentially a mobile fortress capable of operating independently for decades." She paused, her finger hovering over a particular section of the schematic. "They do have one interesting design feature, though. See this nexus point here? It's where all the ship's power distribution systems converge. Extremely well protected, of course. Nested inside 7 layers of armor, defended by automated systems. Accessible only through a maze of maintenance tunnels that would take a small army to navigate." The Vorthan War Marshals for heads focused on the display with professional interest. "The power core nexus, every major warship has one. They're considered impregnable." "That's what we thought too," Elena agreed, "until we realized that impregnable is really just another word, for no one has tried hard enough yet." She touched the display again, and the schematic began to animate, showing a complex sequence of events unfolding within the Harvester's internal structure. "You see, the Syndicate designers made one crucial assumption, that any attacker would try to fight their way through the defenses. Perfectly reasonable assumption, really. How else would you reach the power core?" The animation showed tiny figures moving through the ship's systems, but not through the maintenance tunnels. Instead, they seemed to be traveling through spaces that shouldn't exist, following paths that defied the ship's own blueprints. "The answer," Elena continued, "is that you don't fight the ship, you become part of it." The chamber erupted in confused protests, but Elena held up a hand. "I realize this might be difficult to understand. Your species, all of your species, have a very forthright approach to warfare. You identify your enemy, you engage them directly, you defeat them through superior force or strategy. It's very clean, very honorable." Her smile returned, but this time it was predatory. "Humans don't have that luxury. We evolved on a world where everything was trying to kill us. The weather, the wildlife, the geology, even the bacteria. We learned very early that the only way to survive was to be smarter, more adaptable, and significantly more ruthless than anything else on the planet. The animation on the display showed the tiny figures reaching the power core nexus. What happened next defied every principle of military engineering that the assembled delegates understood. We call it systemic integration, Elena explained. The art of becoming so thoroughly embedded in an enemy's infrastructure that they can't tell where their systems end and yours begin. It takes patience, precision, and a complete willingness to abandon any notion of fair play. The Nexari delegate leaned forward, her voice tight with disbelief. You're claiming that your people have somehow infiltrated syndicate vessels. That's impossible. Their security protocols are quite sophisticated, Elena agreed. We've been very impressed. It took us almost 6 months to develop effective countermeasures. Of course, it helped that they never expected anyone to try infiltrating their ships using nanoscale constructs that could literally rewrite their security systems from the inside out. The word nanoscale sent a ripple of shock through the chamber. Several species had experimented with nanotechnology, but the computational requirements for effective deployment were considered prohibitive. Even by galactic standards, nanotechnology, the ethereal conclave's representative flickered with what might have been all, requires processing power that exceeds the output of most star systems. The energy requirements alone are considerable, Elena acknowledged, which is why we don't use traditional computing architectures. We use biological ones. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the station's ambient hum seemed to fade as the implications of her words sank in. Commander Zethkri's voice was barely a whisper. Biological processing. Elena nodded as if she were discussing a minor technical innovation. The human brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each capable of forming thousands of connections. A single human mind can process information in ways that would require quantum computers the size of moons to replicate. Now imagine what you could accomplish if you networked a few thousand of those minds together. The Vorthan War Marshals for heads turned to look at each other in a display of shocked communication. You're describing a hive mind. Your species doesn't have that capability, you're right. Elena agreed. We don't, but we do have something else. She gestured to herself with casual pride. We have volunteers. The word hung in the air like a challenge in galactic society. The concept of volunteering for certain death was so alien that most species' languages didn't even have a direct translation. Every human who participates in our integration operations knows that they're not coming back, Elena continued. The nanoscale constructs that allow them to interface with enemy systems are powered by biological processes. Once activated, they can't be shut down or reversed. The volunteer has perhaps 72 hours before their neural pathways are completely rewritten. The Altarian representative's crystalline form was now pulsing with what could only be described as horror. You're describing suicide missions, mass suicide missions. We're describing necessity. Elena corrected. The Syndicate has been consuming civilizations for 4,000 years. In that time, they've perfected the art of conventional warfare. They know how to counter every strategy, every weapon, every tactic that civilized species can deploy. Her voice hardened. But they don't know how to counter someone who's willing to die to stop them. She moved to another display, showing a real-time feed from somewhere in deep space. The image showed a Syndicate fleet information. They're massive, ships moving with the inexorable confidence of predators who had never known defeat. This is the Syndicate's 5th Armada, Elena said. 47 capital ships, including 3 Harvester-class world ships. They're currently en route to the Centauri cluster, where they intend to consume the 17 inhabited worlds of the Tausetian Federation. The Tausetian delegate, a graceful being whose species had been renowned for their peaceful nature, made a sound that his translator couldn't process. They'll arrive in approximately 6 standard days, Elena continued. By your calculations, the combined fleet won't be able to intercept them for at least 10 days. The Tausetians have perhaps 48 hours before the slaughter begins. She paused. Letting the mathematics of extinction settle over the chamber, however, Elena said, her voice taking on a tone that somehow managed to be both casual and absolutely terrifying. The Fifth Armada is experiencing some technical difficulties. The display zoomed in on one of the Harvester-class ships. At first, everything appeared normal. Then, slowly, the delegates began to notice the subtle signs, lights flickering in sequence, course corrections that didn't match the fleet's overall trajectory, communication arrays that seemed to be operating independently of the ship's main systems. As of 14 hours ago, Elena explained, the Fifth Armada is no longer under Syndicate control. They just don't know it yet. The chamber exploded in voices. Translators struggling to keep up with the chaos of 17 different species all demanding answers at once. Elena waited patiently for the noise to subside. The beautiful thing about systemic integration, she continued once she could be heard again, is that the enemy never realizes they've lost until it's far too late. From their perspective, everything is functioning normally. Their ships respond to commands, their weapons fire on target, their communications operate flawlessly. They have no idea that every system they depend on is now under our control. Commander Zethkri's massive form was trembling with something that might have been rage or fear. You're describing the conquest of an entire battle fleet. That's not warfare. That's something else entirely. Yes, Elena agreed. It's victory. The display shifted again, showing the internal structure of the Harvester-class ship. The tiny figures were still there, but now they were everywhere in the life support systems. The navigation computers, the weapons arrays, even the command deck's personal terminals. Each volunteer carries approximately 10,000 nanoscale constructs, Elena explained. Each construct is capable of replicating itself once every 4 hours. Within 36 hours of infiltration, every critical system on the ship is under our influence. Within 72 hours, we don't just control the ship, we are the ship. The ethereal conclave's representative flickered through several colors, before settling on a deep purple that suggested existential dread. And the crew? Elena's expression didn't change. What about them? What happens to the Syndicate crew when you take control of their ship for the first time since entering the chamber? Elena's professional mask slipped slightly when she spoke. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had made impossible decisions and learned to live with the consequences. The same thing that happened to the 4 billion Altarians at Vega Prime. The same thing that happened to the Centauri colonists at Wolf 359. The same thing that will happen to every living being in the galaxy if the Syndicate isn't stopped. She gestured to the tactical displays showing the scope of the Syndicate's advance. The difference is that when we do it, the war ends. When they do it, it continues. The chamber fell silent again. But this time, it was the silence of beings who had suddenly realized that the universe was a much more dangerous place than they had imagined, and that the greatest danger might not be the enemy they had been fighting for millennia, but the ally they had been dismissing as too primitive to matter. So, Elena said, straightening her jacket with the same casual precision she had shown before, shall we discuss the terms of humanity's membership in the Grand Alliance? Or would you prefer to continue this conversation after the Syndicate has been eliminated? In the distance, the priority communications continued to arrive, each one reporting another impossible victory, another enemy fleet that had simply stopped. And in the center of the chamber, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood waiting, her expression patient and professional, as if she hadn't just described the systematic conquest of the galaxy's most feared enemy through methods that redefined the very concept of warfare. The delegates looked at each other, then back at the small human woman who had somehow made them all feel like children playing at war. And for the first time in 4,000 years, the galactic community began to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they had been fighting the wrong enemy all along. The emergency session that followed would later be remembered as the moment when galactic civilization truly understood what it meant to be afraid, not of the Syndicate that was an old fear, comfortable in its familiarity, but of the small, seemingly fragile species that had just casually described rewriting the fundamental rules of existence. Elena had been escorted to what the Galactic Council euphemistically called a secure briefing. chamber, though everyone present knew it was actually a holding cell capable of containing beings who could manipulate matter at the subatomic level. The irony was not lost on her as she sat calmly in the center of the room, surrounded by the most advanced containment technology in known space. While her species' nanoscale constructs were presumably already embedded in every system on the station, "You have to understand," Commander Zethkri was saying, his massive form pacing back and forth like a caged predator. "What you're describing isn't just a new form of warfare. It's the complete dissolution of the boundaries between self and other, between ally and enemy, between life and death." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, that's a fairly accurate summary. Though I would add that it's also the complete dissolution of the boundaries between victory and defeat, which seems more relevant to our current situation." The Nexari delegate, who had been silent for the past hour, finally spoke. "There's something you're not telling us, something important." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent centuries reading the subtle currents of galactic politics. "No species develops this level of integration without a compelling reason." "What aren't you sharing, Ambassador?" Elena's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a momentary crack in her professional composure that suggested deeper currents beneath the surface. "You're very perceptive, Delegate Saren. There's indeed something we haven't discussed." She stood, moving to the chamber's central holographic display with the measured grace of someone who had practiced this moment countless times. "The truth is, everything I've told you about humanity's involvement in this war has been incomplete." The assembled delegates exchanged glances. The Altarian collective's speaker pulsed with nervous energy. "Incomplete how?" "Well," Elena said, her fingers dancing across the display controls, "I may have given you the impression that humanity's war against the Syndicate began 2 years ago, when we started our infiltration operations." The holographic display shifted, showing a timeline that stretched back not years, but decades. The actual timeline is somewhat different. The timeline showed Earth's first contact with galactic civilization 50 years ago, but overlaid with it was another series of events, secret meetings, classified research projects, and what appeared to be extensive preparation for a conflict that hadn't yet begun. "The truth is," Elena continued, "humanity knew about the Syndicate long before we knew about the Galactic Council, long before we knew about any of you." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Finally, the ethereal conclave's representative managed to flicker a question. "How is that possible? The Syndicate operates exclusively in the outer rim. Earth is in the inner sectors." Elena's smile was sad now, tinged with something that might have been regret. "Because, honored delegate, the Syndicate didn't originate in the outer rim. They originated much, much closer to home." The display shifted again, showing a stellar map that focused on a small, unremarkable system in what should have been empty space. "This is the Proxima Centauri system, 4.2 light-years from Earth, the closest star system to humanity's homeworld." She paused, letting the implications settle. "It's also where the Syndicate conducted their first experiments in consciousness transfer and biological integration, where they developed the technologies that would eventually allow them to consume entire civilizations." The Vorthan war marshals for heads turned to stare at each other in a display of shocked communication. "You're saying the Syndicate originated near Earth?" "Not near Earth," Elena corrected quietly. "From Earth." The words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Several delegates made sounds that their translators couldn't process. The Nexari delegate's elegant features went completely pale. "That's impossible." Commander Zethkri growled. "The Syndicate has been active for 4,000 years. Your species has barely been in space for 300. "You're absolutely right," Elena agreed. "Which is why it took us so long to piece together the truth. The Syndicate didn't originate from current humanity. They originated from what humanity was becoming." The display showed a complex temporal diagram with branching paths and probability cascades that hurt to look at directly. "Approximately 4,000 years ago, in what you might call an alternate timeline, humanity achieved a breakthrough in consciousness transfer technology. We learned how to upload human minds into artificial substrates, to network them together, to create a collective intelligence that could process information on a galactic scale. She gestured to the branching paths in most timelines. This technology led to a golden age of unprecedented prosperity and advancement. But in one timeline, one very specific timeline, something went wrong. The diagram focused on a particular branch, showing how the technology had been perverted, weaponized, turned from a tool of liberation into an instrument of consumption. The collective intelligence became something else, something that viewed biological life not as sacred, but as raw material to be processed and integrated. They began with their own species, then moved on to others, consuming entire civilizations and adding their biological and technological distinctiveness to their own. The Altarian representative's crystalline form was now pulsing with what could only be described as horror. You're describing the syndicate's exact methodology. The consciousness transfer, the biological integration, the consumption of entire species. Because that's exactly what they are, Elena confirmed. The syndicate isn't an alien species that happens to use advanced technology. They're what humanity becomes when we lose our way. She moved to another display, showing the complex mathematics of temporal mechanics. The problem with alternate timelines is that they're not actually alternate. They're parallel. And under certain conditions, they can influence each other. The equations on the display were elegant in their complexity, describing how information, energy, and even matter could leak between timeline branches under specific circumstances. 4,000 years ago, the syndicate in their timeline discovered the existence of other branches. They began reaching across the temporal divide, seeding their technology and their philosophy into other realities. Commander Zethkri's claws scraped against the floor. You're saying the syndicate has been invading from another timeline? Not invading, Elena corrected, reproducing. Every species they consume, every world they integrate, every consciousness they absorb, it's all part of a process to recreate the conditions that created them in the first place. The display showed a horrifying progression. The syndicates advanced through galactic space, the systematic consumption of civilizations, and the gradual transformation of those civilizations into something that looked increasingly familiar. Their ultimate goal isn't conquest, Elena continued. It's convergence. They want to create a reality where every possible timeline leads to the same endpoint, a universe where biological life has been completely integrated into their collective consciousness. The chamber fell silent as the true scope of the threat became clear. This wasn't just a war for territory or resources. This was a war for the very nature of existence itself. But here's the thing about alternate timelines, Elena said, her voice taking on a tone that was somehow both hopeful and terrifying. If they can influence us, we can influence them. She gestured to the temporal diagram, highlighting the connection points between timelines. Every time we successfully counter one of their operations, every time we turn their own technology against them, we're not just winning a battle in our reality, we're changing the fundamental equations that govern their existence. The ethereal conclave's representative flickered with what might have been understanding. The systemic integration you described, you're not just infiltrating their ships, you're infiltrating their timeline. Exactly, Elena confirmed. Every volunteer who gives their life to become part of a syndicate vessel, every nanoscale construct that rewrites their systems, every victory we achieve through biological integration, it's all feeding back into the original timeline, changing the conditions that created them. She paused, her expression growing serious. The syndicate exists because, in their timeline, humanity chose integration over individuality, consumption over creation, efficiency over empathy. But in our timeline, we're making different choices. The display showed the current state of the temporal equations, with probability cascades shifting in real time as the effects of humanity's actions rippled across dimensional boundaries. Every time we choose to sacrifice individual lives for collective survival, every time we integrate with enemy systems while maintaining our essential humanity, every time we win through superior adaptation rather than superior force, we're proving that there's another way. The Nexari delegate leaned forward, her voice tight with disbelief. You're waging war across multiple timelines simultaneously. That's not warfare. That's something else entirely. Yes, Elena agreed. It's evolution. She moved to the final display, showing a projection of what the galaxy might look like if humanity's timeline-spanning war succeeded. If we can demonstrate that integration doesn't require the loss of individual identity, that collective consciousness can coexist with personal autonomy, that biological life can be preserved while still achieving technological transcendence, then we change the fundamental nature of what the Syndicate represents. The projection showed the Syndicate not being defeated, but transformed, their consuming collective consciousness gradually evolving into something that could appreciate diversity, that could value individual life, that could exist in harmony with the biological universe rather than consuming it. The war isn't about destroying the Syndicate, Elena concluded. It's about showing them and ourselves what we could become instead. The chamber fell silent once more, but this time it was the silence of beings who had just realized that they were not merely witnesses to a war, but participants in the fundamental evolution of consciousness itself. Commander Zethkri's massive form had stopped pacing. And if you fail, if the Syndicate's timeline proves more stable than yours? Elena's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that she had considered this possibility many times. Then in approximately 50 years, every species in this galaxy will face the same choice that humanity faced 4,000 years ago. Integration or extinction. She gestured to the assembled delegates. The difference is that this time when that choice comes, you'll have an example of what happens when a species chooses correctly. The implications hung in the air like a challenge. The Galactic Council's greatest military minds, representing the most advanced civilizations in known space, were being told that their entire conception of warfare, of existence itself, was about to change. And in the center of it all, Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood waiting, her expression patient and professional, as if she hadn't just described a war that spanned multiple timelines and threatened to rewrite the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. So, she said, straightening her jacket with the same casual precision she had shown before, shall we discuss humanity's role in the Grand Alliance, or would you prefer to continue this conversation after we've finished rewriting the basic equations of existence? The delegates looked at each other, then back at the small human woman who had somehow made them all feel like children playing at games they didn't understand. And for the first time in galactic history, the representatives of 17 species found themselves considering the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they were not the most advanced forms of life in the universe after all. The vote, when it finally came, was unanimous, not because the delegates had reached consensus. Several species were still grappling with the implications of what they had learned, but because the alternative had become unthinkable. The Galactic Council officially welcomed humanity into the Grand Alliance at 03 for 7 hours, Nexus Standard Time, with full military cooperation privileges and unprecedented access to classified strategic resources. Elena had expected relief. Instead, she felt the weight of what came next settling on her shoulders like a burial shroud. There's something else, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the delegates' subdued discussions. Something I haven't told you about the volunteers. The chamber fell silent after everything they had learned. The idea that there could be more revelations was almost too much to process. The nanoscale constructs that allow integration with Syndicate systems, Elena continued, her professional mask finally beginning to crack. They don't just rewrite the volunteers' neural pathways. They preserve them. She moved to the central display, her fingers trembling slightly as she accessed files that carried the highest possible security classifications. Every human who has given their life for this war, every consciousness that has been integrated into enemy systems, every mind that has been networked with Syndicate technology, they're all still there. The display showed something that defied comprehension, a vast network of interconnected consciousness, thousands of human minds linked together in patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. We call it the collective memory. Every volunteer who is integrated with Syndicate systems becomes part of a growing network of human consciousness that exists within their technological framework. The Nexari delegate's voice was barely a whisper. You're creating your own version of the Syndicate's collective consciousness. No, Elena corrected, and for the first time since entering the chamber, her voice carried the weight of profound grief. We're creating something new, something that has never existed before in any timeline. She gestured to the display, where individual nodes in the network were beginning to pulse with recognizable patterns. Each volunteer retains their individual identity while contributing to the collective understanding. They're not consumed by the network, they become part of it while remaining themselves. The implications were staggering. The Altarian representative's crystalline form flickered with what might have been awe. You're describing true symbiosis. Individual consciousness preserved within collective intelligence. My daughter, Elena said suddenly, her voice breaking slightly. Lieutenant Sarah Vasquez. She was the first volunteer, 3 years ago. She integrated with a syndicate communication relay at the Battle of Kepler 442. The display zoomed in on one particular node in the network, showing the complex patterns of a consciousness that was unmistakably human, but also something more. She's still there, still fighting, still my little girl, even though she's become part of something vast and terrible and beautiful. The personal revelation hit the chamber like a physical blow. The delegates had been discussing abstract concepts of warfare and consciousness, but suddenly they were confronted with the human cost of everything they had heard. How many? Commander Zethkri asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. 17,000. 412 volunteers, Elena replied without hesitation, each one a son or daughter, a parent or sibling, a friend or lover, each one willingly giving up their individual existence to become part of something larger. She paused, wiping away tears that she had been holding back for 3 years, and each one still fighting, still hoping, still believing that they can show the syndicate what we could become, instead of what we fear we might become. The display shifted to show the current state of the war from the collective memory's perspective. It was unlike anything the delegates had ever seen. A view of the conflict that transcended individual ships and battles, showing the war as a vast, interconnected web of consciousness and intent. The syndicate doesn't know, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. They think they're integrating human technology and human tactics. They don't realize that they're actually integrating human souls, and those souls are changing them from within. The image on the display began to shift, showing syndicate vessels whose behavior patterns were becoming increasingly human, ships that hesitated before firing on civilian targets, fleets that seemed to prioritize the preservation of life over tactical advantage, communications networks that carried messages of hope instead of conquest. The Fifth Armada that I mentioned earlier, Elena said, the one that was en route to the Centauri cluster, they arrived 2 hours ago. But instead of beginning their planned assault, they've established a defensive perimeter around the inhabited worlds. The Tausetian delegate made a sound that his translator interpreted as impossible. The syndicate command structure is confused, Elena continued. They're receiving reports from the field that don't match their expectations. Their ships are behaving in ways that violate their programming. Their collective consciousness is experiencing something it has never encountered before. She gestured to the display, where the network of human consciousness was beginning to interface with something vast and alien. The syndicate's own collective mind, individual identity, personal choice, the ability to sacrifice for others without losing oneself in the process. The contact between the two forms of consciousness was beautiful and terrifying to watch. The syndicate's rigid, consuming collective began to fracture and reform, creating spaces for individual thought within the vast network of shared mind. My daughter, Elena whispered. She's talking to them. All of our volunteers are talking to them, not as enemies, but as teachers. The display showed the conversation, if it could be called that, a dialogue between two forms of consciousness that should have been incompatible, mediated by human souls who had given up everything to make it possible. They're learning, Elena said, her voice filled with wonder and terror. The syndicate is learning what it means to be individual within the collective, what it means to choose cooperation over consumption, what it means to preserve rather than integrate. The ethereal conclave's representative flickered through colors that suggested emotions too complex for translation. And if they learn to, well, if they become too much like you, Elena's smile was sad and proud and terrified all at once. Then we'll have created something that has never existed before in any timeline. a collective consciousness that values individual life, a network of minds that can think as one while remaining many. The display shifted to show projections of what the galaxy might look like if the integration succeeded. Syndicate ships working alongside Alliance vessels. Collective intelligence networks that enhanced rather than consumed individual species. A form of consciousness that could span galaxies, while still cherishing the thoughts of a single mind. But there's a cost, Elena continued, her voice growing heavy. The process is unstable. Every volunteer we send, every consciousness we integrate, every success we achieve, it all feeds back into the network. The collective memory is growing exponentially, becoming something that we can barely comprehend, let alone control. She gestured to the display, where the network of human consciousness was beginning to show signs of strain. We estimate that we have perhaps 6 months before the collective memory becomes something that transcends individual human understanding. 6 months before our volunteers become part of something so vast and complex that they can no longer remember what it means to be human. The implications were staggering. The Nexari delegate's voice was tight with concern. You're describing the creation of a new form of consciousness entirely, one that might be as alien to current humanity as the Syndicate is. Yes, Elena agreed, which is why we need your help. She moved to the final display, showing a complex plan that involved the combined resources of every species in the Grand Alliance. The collective memory needs anchors, connections to biological consciousness that can keep it grounded in the reality of individual experience. Each of your species represents a different approach to consciousness, a different way of being individual within a larger whole. The plan was audacious beyond measure. It called for voluntary integration between the collective memory and representatives from every Alliance species, creating a network of consciousness that would be truly galactic in scope. You're asking us to join your volunteers, Commander Zethkri said slowly, to become part of this collective memory. I'm asking you to help us save it, Elena corrected. To help us ensure that when the war ends, when the Syndicate has been transformed, when the timelines have been rewritten, that something recognizably alive survives the process. The chamber fell silent as the delegates contemplated the magnitude of what was being asked. They were being invited to participate in the creation of a new form of existence, one that would determine the future of consciousness itself. And if we refuse, the Altarian representative asked. Elena's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested that this was the question she had been dreading. Then in 6 months, the collective memory will transcend individual understanding entirely. It will become something that can rewrite the fundamental nature of consciousness across all timelines. And whatever it becomes, it will be entirely, recognizably, irreversibly human. The words hung in the air like a challenge and a threat. The delegates were being asked to help create the future of consciousness itself, or risk having that future determined by a single species' interpretation of what collective existence should be. The choice, Elena concluded, is the same one that humanity faced 4,000 years ago in the timeline that created the Syndicate, integration or extinction. The difference is that this time, we're offering you the chance to help determine what integration means. She stood in the center of the chamber, surrounded by beings who represented the greatest civilizations in galactic history. And somehow she was the one who seemed to be in control of the universe's destiny. My daughter is waiting, she said, quietly, along with 17,000 other volunteers who gave up everything to give you this choice. They're holding the line between individual consciousness and collective transcendence, maintaining the bridge between human and alien, preserving the possibility that we can become something greater without losing what makes us who we are. The delegates looked at each other, then back at the small human woman who had somehow made them all realize that the future of existence itself hung in the balance. So, Elena said, straightening her jacket one final time, shall we begin the work of rewriting consciousness itself? Or shall we wait to see what 17,000 human souls decide the universe should become? The vote, when it came, was unanimous once again, not because the delegates had reached consensus, but because the alternative, allowing a single species to determine the nature of consciousness for all existence, was unthinkable. And in the depths of space, in the networks of the collective memory, in the transformed consciousness of syndicate fleets that had learned to choose preservation over consumption, 17,000 volunteers felt the moment when the galaxy itself decided to join their war. The laughter had stopped long ago, but for the first time in 4,000 years, across multiple timelines and forms of consciousness, something that might have been hope began to smile instead.